Another member of the Trail Trekkers is here. He's going to be asking me questions. And we have a little script we're going to follow, but hopefully it'll be kind of informal. I just want to say that we have several other events from the festival that are currently recorded and are online on our website. And they're both very good events, so check them out. I'd like to thank the El Cerrito Historical Society, which is co-sponsoring this particular event and is also letting us use their Zoom account. The Historical Society is a great group. I'm the president of it. Check them out. We're always looking for more members. We're getting ready, I think, before the end of the year to have actual live events with the Historical Society. And maybe we'll have some live ones with trekkers too. Okay, so let's get going with the history of the hillside. And Wade, you want to say a couple of things.
I just wanted to mention how this little event came about. We were talking about being online and being stuck in the pandemic mode, and it occurred to some of us that because of your background and history in El Cerrito with trail trekkers, also with the Historical Society, it might be a good idea to have an opportunity to have a discussion with you about your experiences and what that's been like. So that's the genesis of this conversation. And as Dave mentioned, we do have a few questions and topics that we wanted to make sure we get to. And we have, as you can already see, a few slides with some photos that we'll refer to. But as Dave mentioned, we really want to encourage people to ask questions or comments, and we'll open up we'll keep an eye on the chat space as well. So if you have questions or comments during the course of the conversation, please post those in there, and we'll try to get those in as we're going, if you don't mind. So why don't we start out by, Dave, why don't you just tell us a little bit about how you first got really interested in the El Cerrito Hills, and what sort of drew you into trying to put together the Trail Trekkers in the first place?
Well, it was the Berkeley path warners, really, and all of their great paths. I was walking on them, then walking through El Cerrito with my dog and noticing all of the different things that looked like trails, and some I didn't know if they were trails or not. I'm thinking about some of the urban paths. You know, there are some of them that look like they're people's driveways or even little walkways by people's houses, and they're actually trails. And it took a while, and that's what really got us going. And we've been around now for about 12 years. And I think it's a pretty good organization. And, it's interesting with the hills in El Cerrito. A lot of time when people associate El Cerrito with hills, they think Albany Hill, because it was called El Cerrito. But in actual fact, it's the hills and the hillside that I think fascinated people who lived here originally. The El Cerrito Journal, back in the 30s and 40s, had a popular column. It kind of summarized everything going on in town, and it was called At the Foot of the Hills. So in other words, people who lived in El Cerrito saw themselves as living at the foot of the hills, not in the hills, but at the foot of the hills. And working with trail trekkers for the past dozen years, I've really come to see a theme in the way the hills work in El Cerrito or don't work. And that's largely that city leaders, city officials, the city council in general has ignored the hillside. That's not to say that I don't get along really well with Stephen Prey and some other city officials. And they do and have kept the trails up. And they do and are increasing the amount of work they do to control fire. But when it comes to vision, when it comes to any overall thinking, what are these hills all about? There's been nothing from city officials. What there has been has come from the groundswell up, from people in the community. And I think as I go along, as Wade and I go along today, we will learn more about that.
Well, why do you think that is? What do you think is the source of that attitude about the government?
I think it's laziness. I don't know. City councils, they have a lot going on, and a lot of things are just slamming them in the face. I mean, right now, of course, they're going fiscally bankrupt, and so that's what they're worried about. But there's always things going on: police, fires, and the hills just kind of sit there like a big mess, and they're not really doing anything for the city to worry about. But they exert, a kind of almost like dreamlike state in some respects. And occasionally, we've seen how city officials have gotten excited. Do you guys know the artist Benny Bufano? You guys know him. He's done all kinds of sculptures of bears and St. Francis's, and you see him in parks all over the place. Well, this is back in, gosh, when was it? Right about 1960. And he had a statue of St. Francis. It was in front of a church, well, St. Francis Assisi Church in North Beach in San Francisco. And he had to move the church because the priest who was running it he had to move the statue. And so Benny was looking around for a place to put this, and where should I put it? Where is it going to go? Oakland. And Bufano, by the way, he was a guy with big dreams. You know, El Capitan in Yosemite. He wanted to put a giant mosaic work of art right on the ledge of El Capitan. So he liked big schemes. And Robert Bonney, who was the city's park and rec director back then in El Cerrito, he had a great idea. He said, why don't we, because Bufano was essentially going to move the thing for free. Why don't we get the giant statue of St. Francis and put it right at the top of the hillside overlooking the old quarry in what is today the recycling center. And he had another idea too, which was, this was described in the paper, a large fountain whose waters could be floodlighted as a beacon visible all the way to San Francisco and throughout the East Bay. So picture that if we saw it right there above the recycling center. And believe it or not, the city council actually sort of got into this idea, and the Richmond Independent, with the headline, "Some Flights of Fancy Over Park," reported that they were actually giving it some serious thought. Well, of course, it never happened. And we're back to the hillside.
So why do you think it is that the city has never really sort of embraced the park as an historical centerpiece of the town?
Well, as I said, it's just not giving it much thought. They didn't turn their backs on it. Actually, that's not true. I just said they didn't turn their backs on it, but they have. I was once told by the city's park and rec director, Joel Witherell, who was here in the 70s and 80s, that several times the city went to East Bay Regional Park District and asked the park district to take over the hillside. The city wanted to wash its hands of it. And as a matter of fact, early in the pandemic and the fiscal crisis, the same kind of conversation was happening. Why don't we give it to the East Bay Park District? Well, of course, why would the park district take it unless the city was to pay them to do it? I mean, the city's idea was just to escape spending money on it. And the last thing park district wants to do is spend a lot of money on it. So I think the city's kind of stuck with it. Again, I don't want to come down too harsh on the city because Stephen Prey has just done a lot of work in there. He's the city's arborist and one of the environmental guys. Really hard work, and he works in Baxter Creek. But as I said, so much that has happened has been done by the various volunteer groups. Friends of Five Creeks under Susan Schwartz, they've probably been working in the hillside area for, I don't know, 20 years maybe. There are all kinds of areas that used to be filled with broom and other invasive species that really have been cleared. Trail Trekkers has done a tremendous work there. Recently, we've had the Rotary Club come in, put in the interpretive signs and those beautiful benches. The green teams, the Environmental Quality Committee green teams. So here we have the Motorcycle Hill Trail. That was all built by volunteers. The El Cerrito Mountain High School Mountain Biking Club helped build that. Motorcycle Hill was a place that when I was first walking the hillside, and I'm sure a lot of you remember this, you would walk in from Potrero, go up to the top where there are a bunch of eucalyptus trees and occasionally a swing, but you couldn't go any further. You could not go down the hill. It was just so full of French broom and poison oak, and there were no trails, and it was really steep. But now, we really opened that up. So I think it just shows that the people who live in El Cerrito have always been committed to doing that. I spelled "the" wrong. But it's not that the city council never thought about it.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting documents dates 1974, when they were updating the city's general plan, looking at updating the recreation and parks element of that. So they hired a consultant, J.A. Basham, to look at, among other things, the Hillside Natural Area. And it's kind of sad and pathetic, actually, because he described the Hillside Natural Area at that time as being 148 acres. When Trekkers was founded, it was about 90 acres. And today, because of the Madeira open space purchase, it's 100 acres. Okay, so what happened to those missing 48 acres? What Basham was talking about was all the vacant land that was owned by the city or that was adjacent to it and could have been owned by the city. And he came up with some really, really good ideas that unfortunately were never implemented.
So you think there were some real missed opportunities there?
Well, yeah, that's for sure. Matter of fact, if the city had followed through what Basham wanted to do, there wouldn't be a trail trackers now because there wouldn't be any need for us. Okay, I mean, this is not a joke. This is almost not a joke. Matter of fact, let me go back and read you some of what he said. This is Basham in '74. Yeah. So bear in mind, '74 was 2 years after the BART stations opened. So his plan was to connect the BART stations with Wildcat Canyon with a series of trails through the hillside area and also going on some of the urban trails that exist today, many of which are still impassable. And he probably would have built more trails. It goes back, if you've ever done much walking in France or Italy, for example, you'll be in some small town in the south of France. You'll see little signs painted on the sides of buildings, red and black, and these are either grand randonnées or petite randonnées. And you follow these little painted signs from some cute town. Next thing, you're in the woods someplace, in the mountain, and there's more signs, and you come out, you're in another town. So the whole thing connects. And so that was kind of Trekker's idea. And it was Basham's too. So he talked about how, well, he mentioned, for example, how the northern and the southern part of the hillside area currently in '74 had no good connection. You had to walk on roads to get between them. And that was the case. Nothing changed until 2015 when we finally bought the Madeira open space and were able to put a trail through there. So it took something like 40 years for that to happen. So Basham talked about how the BART, the Wildcat Canyon Trail through Hillside Park, will become an important link in extended round-trip hikes in which BART is used by the hikers to return to the starting point. So he saw BART and the trails and the hillside and Wildcat as one kind of big.
So he had a whole system, kind of an integrated system envisioned.
Yeah, he was smart. He was a really good idea. And guess what? To some extent, believe it or not, the city council, which at that time was fairly liberal, they were, more or less the same council that had approved the recycling center. The city council sort of bought this idea. In '76, 2 years after the Basham plan, the council approves El Cerrito Park project. That was the headline. Okay, a Del Norte trail will be constructed with $6,000 in county funds and will stretch from the El Cerrito Del Norte bar station through Canyon Trail Park into the Hillside Natural Area, into Arlington Park, and through to the East Bay Regional Wildcat Canyon. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot to get for $6,000. And guess what? They never got it because none of those trails exists. Right. But those are the kind of things that we're trying to do now.
And that's a kind of a vision that we could still accomplish.
Yeah. But to answer your question I can't answer your question about why the city council ignores things, but I can give you some examples of how they do. Okay.
Well, so why is probably a complicated question anyway.
Well, I think it's laziness. But back quite a number of years ago, probably 10 or 12, we got a grant, not money, but we got, when I say we, I mean the trekkers, we got a service grant from the National Park Service. They came in, they developed the beautiful map that you all know. And that was all a prelude to developing a system of trail signs. Yeah. And the idea there was to have trail signs functioning like the ones in Europe, but more like signs. And they would integrate all the urban trails, all the past stairways with the hillside, and they'd be set up all over. And they're beautiful. We have a beautiful plan. They're gorgeous, okay? And the city originally said they were going to fund these things. They had the funding. Then they said, well, we don't really have the funding for those urban ones, but we do for the hillside. Where are those signs? Okay,
and we're still struggling to get those signs.
Yeah, I'm starting to think. Anyhow, let's not go off onto a. Let's not get off onto a negative thing.
Well, maybe we can get back into a little bit more of the history and in fact even the deeper history before you have the city of El Cerrito at all. There were Native Americans living in the region. What can you tell us about that period of the history?
Yeah, my old buddy Richard Schwartz, he knows all about it. He could tell you He could tell you where all the Indian settlements were in the hills, but of course he won't, because he doesn't want people to go to him and deface them. One of the best examples that people do know about is the Petroglyph here. This is shown with Jim McKissick, who's done so much work to restore Canyon Trail Park and other native habitats throughout this area. So that's a large rock right by the foot of Canyon Trail, and it's well known for having a Native American petroglyphs on them. I guess less well known is what those are for. They don't really appear to have had a functional use. But yeah, there were Native Americans, throughout this area. It was very widely settled, and it's interesting. On one of the very first hillside festivals, speaking of the arrival of the Spanish, we had a member of the National Park Service, Anza Trail outfit. He came in and he had a picture. He showed a drawing by Pedro Font, who accompanied the Anza expedition in 1775. You can't see it real well here. What he's doing, he's pointing at Nickel Knob in Point Richland, and he's holding a drawing that Pedro Font did in 1775. And darn it, if those hills that you're looking at don't look like Pedro Font was standing right here where Dan Sanchez is standing and did that drawing right there. I mean, maybe I'm like going too far here, but it sure looks to me like the Anza expedition passed through that section of the hillside, which is right above the recycling center, quite a number of years ago. And so,
well, I was just going to say, then maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what the hills were really like at this point in time.
If you look at pictures that we have in the Historical Society archive, like this one, this shows the Kennel Club. Some of you may not know that the hottest thing happening from 32 to 39 in this town was dog racing at the Kennel Club. And you look at the hills behind, and they're still fairly denuded, even though we're coming up to World War II. So yeah, there were not a lot of people living in the El Cerrito Hills really until after World War II. If you walk around in the hills today, you'll see any number of houses that do go back to the teens. So there are some even a little bit earlier. And then around Barrett Avenue, north of town, you see a lot of those Piedmont style houses, nice period revival, big houses. And they got built on these kind of easier streets. Barrett, it curves up the hill easily. So those date to the 20s. And it's also interesting to think about the history of the hills in El Cerrito, what an important role they played in attracting people to town, both dead people and live people, and how a lot of the impetus behind them were from people not in El Cerrito, who were mostly working class people just getting by, but from Berkeley, who wanted things but didn't want them to be in Berkeley. So it was people from Berkeley who built first Sunset View Cemetery so they can bury themselves and their family. And that was like in the early 1900s.
And we had a hike up in the cemetery that went through the history up there.
Yeah, no, it's a great place to go hiking, and we've led some with the Historical Society. And that was one of the first things that brought people to town. They'd get off the streetcar right about Central Avenue and San Pablo Avenue, and there'd be special carts taking them from Sunset View to bring them up there and show them around. It's all a plot. And of course, the golf course came in the 20s. It was called the Berkeley Golf Course and Mira Vista Country Club, then Berkeley again.
So you had a lot of uses up in the hills prior to there being any residential up there.
Yeah,
you talked about the cemetery, right? And the golf course, and then Motorcycle Hill had a lot of use up there before there were a lot of houses up there too, right? That's where it got its name, right?
Motorcycle Hill, yeah. Trekkers named that a few years ago. The only name it had, and nobody used it, was Peralta Hill. If you look at some maps.
Oh, okay.
But since so many things are named Peralta, we just thought it was, kind of boring. But Motorcycle Hill had motorcycle hill climbs starting in the 1920s. It was the Oakland Motorcycle Club. They decided that it was the steepest place they could find with like 80-degree angles. That's hard to believe.
Yeah.
That's what it said in the newspaper. And these things, this was not nothing. I mean, let me see what I got here. Yeah, here we go. hill climbing contest brings over 50,000 people to El Cerrito. This is 1925. The steepest hill in the East Bay section. 50,000. I don't know if that's
hard to imagine 50,000 people on that hill.
But people like motorcycle hill climbs, and there are signs, the realtors put up signs, El Cerrito, watch us grow. And they're trying to sell lots.
But you just said something that I didn't know before. I want to make sure we get this clear, because we got an image up here. These motorcycle races were going up there, but it wasn't called Motorcycle Hill at that time?
No, it wasn't. I'm not sure. No, they didn't refer to it as that.
That's interesting. Okay.
But around the time that Jenny Hammer, I remember Trekker, started to build this trail, really build the Motorcycle Hill Trail.
Yeah.
Well, you had to name the place something.
Had to name it something. And this goes back to the image we showed a long time earlier in this conversation about the trail building on Motorcycle Hill that took place a few years ago, and that really developed that.
Because the fact that there weren't trees in the hills, that remained the case until really recently. When that church on Navalier, the Swedenborgian church, was built, they did a postcard, and today it's like a dense forest. Back then there were no trees. As a matter of fact, people that I know, people that I've spoken to, I forget who they were. Yeah, not at all, about my age. Motorcycle Hill, I told you how dense it was with growth. Well, there used to be, are those power poles? Power poles used to march down in a straight line down Motorcycle Hill down to Navalier. And there used to be just a straight trail all the way down there, and people could easily do that. Mm-hmm. But by the time the 80s were around, it was, totally covered up. But I do want to talk about one other use in the hills that people might occasionally.
Well, I was just going to come to that. The quarries, right?
Quarries. There were some quarries.
And the quarry at the bottom of the hillside, south end of the hillside park, is one of the most distinctive features in that area. So what can you tell us about those quarries?
Okay. Well, the hills had several quarries. There was one where the recycling center is now. And that was the Hutchinson and later Brown and Hutchinson quarry, and that goes back to 1903. And they mostly mined like stone that would be used in road work. It wasn't like gold or platinum or lithium or even like Vermont granite. It was workaday type stuff. Now, I hope you've all been to Camp Herms. Has anybody been to Camp Herms? What a great place that is. Camp Herms has what used to be the quarry now, has one of the most beautiful structures I know any place, which is a stone building that housed what used to be a swimming pool. It's just amazing. And that quarry there was also one of the major quarries. There were a few other small ones. I assume you all know Murrieta Rock, where a guy is building a house right now just behind the rock. The rock itself is still for sale. And speaking of the hills, that would kind of define the look of the El Cerrito Hills, because before there were a lot of trees, you could see Murrieta Rock standing out like a thumb sticking out of the top of the hills, the East Bay Hills from San Francisco. It was you could. People will look at it. You could, It was an amazing thing. Later, it got covered up with poison oak and acacia trees or whatever they are there. So that hill, Murrieta Rock, was partially mined.
Okay.
Now it's interesting. The Bates and Borland quarry, which was where the Boy Scout camp was, also included Arlington Park. And until a few years ago, there's that series of staircases that go from Contra Costa all the way up to Arlington Park. Yeah. Up until a few years ago, if you look to your right, you could see a little tunnel where the tram tracks went. And these trams would take rock from the Bates and Borland quarry, Camp Herms, all the way down to Cerrito Vista Park, where there was a tremendous kind of tram system or a transom, and the rock would then get dumped into a spur of the Santa Fe Railroad and taken away to be used. And somebody built a fence along the last leg of that Arlington path, blocking this historic view, which is too bad. But I do have one little anecdote to tell you, which is that this is from a story written in 1970 based on a longtime historian. It was not uncommon for some of those tram cars to leave the hill on their downward trek, and the hillside was often littered with lost wheels, cables, and rollers. Well, one day, one of these trams just lost it. It just was going, flying down as fast as it could, okay? And this youngster, what's his name? I want to give you his name. Thurston Stark. Thurston Stark.
That's a good name.
It is. It is. Like, and Thurston Stark, he saw this coming, okay? And he saw there was going to be a train coming along the main part of the Santa Fe, and he ran like that, waving his hands, and he stopped the train, preventing massive loss of life.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's good. So with all these activities in the hills, how did eventually this area finally become a park?
You know, the history of the park is a little bit obscure. I wish I knew, for example, who built all the roads up there. I wish I knew, I wish I had a list of the acquisitions. But we know that the park got its actual start right about 1943. I told you about a guy named Forrest Brown. He became a partner with Hutchinson, and then he became the sole owner in 1942. El Cerrito was changing in 1942. This was the time of World War II. And, you know, people used to think, well, during World War II, people didn't build a lot of houses because all the material went for the war. But that's not true in El Cerrito or Richmond, where there were slapping up houses by the dozen. And the town was really changing. And not just that, the city, I mentioned the dog raising. We had hoodlums. This was a town full of hoodlums. It was full of quarries. It was full of like city council people on the take, of police on the take. It was kind of a dirty, rotten place. And a lot of people who were moving to town, and even some longtime ones, they were organizing against the dog track because there were outbreaks of flea infestations in town. They were organizing against the gamblers who were running the town, and they were also not too happy with some of the quarries because these things were using dynamite to blow up hillsides, you know, not that far from their homes. The Bates and Borland one, way up in the hills, that went out of business in the 1920s, right about the time, you know, that mansion across the street from it. That's the George Friend house, and George Friend, he was subdividing the land up there. So that quarry went out of business in about 22, sold it to the Boy Scouts. So anyhow, Forrest Brown saw the writing on the wall, and he decided to close the quarry, and he donated a fair amount of land, about 38 acres, including the site of what I said, the recycling center, to the city of El Cerrito. The city of El Cerrito, according to something I read back in the 70s in the Trib, this is probably true. They said, you know what we'll do, Forrest Brown? We're going to call this the Forrest Brown Hillside Park. Well, they never did that either, but when it came time for trail trekkers to name the trails, one of the trails that had an existing name was the Forrest Brown Trail, and we have kept that. And I know that I mentioned earlier the Swedenborgian Church. I spoke years ago to one of their early members who told me that they donated a fair amount of land in that part of the area to the park. And as Basham, that guy who wrote the 74 report, suggested, the hillside exists as a park, quote, because it's steep, impractical for developers to develop. Unstable soil makes recreation area by cut and fill impossible. So in other words, a lot of people who might have owned some of this land just didn't want it. And so they threw it off to the city, which over the years, not really prizing this land, this gradually allowed a lot of it to get developed. Now, I'm not saying, and I kind of misspoke, it's not like the city owns some of it, but I mean, Basham's plan called for them to take positive efforts to acquire it. I mean, when I first came to the city, the area of Regency Court, I thought that was the Hillside Park, you know? That was one of the major, like, you know, potential areas that could have become Hillside. It was probably the last that really got taken over.
So the impression I'm getting here is that you have a hillside in El Cerrito that was in large part used for whatever purposes it could be by a community that was living down in flatlands. And then when various evolution of the city, complaints about the noise in the quarries, for example, kind of brought some of that activity to an end, that you still didn't have a critical mass of interest in the area as an open space. Some of the neglect you just talked about that allowed some of the residential development to take place, despite some of the ideas of Basham and others to develop this area. So if that's sort of the legacy of the history that we come to, and trail trekkers, as we know, being at the forefront of efforts to try to keep the area that we still have as open space, what's your sense of where the future is?
You know, I haven't touted our own horns, I don't think, sufficiently about how we managed to preserve the Madeira open space. You know, if Gary Hill, the high school mountain bike team, didn't go to the owner of that land And the owner had tried to develop it for like decades. Well, actually, it was a succession of owners. But Gary went to the guy and said, "Are you interested in unlawing this land? You're never going to be able to develop it. Let's turn it into open space." And the guy said, maybe. So we managed to get Trust for Public Land in there.
Yeah.
The city had been working for years, for a couple of years, on planning out how to spend a whole bunch of like regional park bond funds. A lot of time went into that. The Park and Rec Commission, they had they spent a lot of time figuring it out. And then we came there and we said, "Hey, all your plans, forget about them. Why don't you spend a whole bunch of money to buy open space, instead?" And they managed to agree to do that. And so a lot of sorry about my wife. I hope you can hear us banging. Anyhow, a lot of effort went into like raising more money, and we managed to buy Madeira open space. And one of the things that I keep pointing out to people, one of the most important things there, and it's easy to forget, not only do we acquire the Madeira open space, but by acquiring it, we ensured that the entirety of the existing Hillside Natural Area will remain open space forever. And the reason that happened was the federal government gave us $250,000, and they made the city sign something attached to the title of the land saying that. So they can't, you couldn't build tennis courts there. You couldn't do cut and fill. You can't put a community center there. You can't sell it for development. That was a major accomplishment. And now we have Fairview open space, which is double the size that Madeira was. There's been all kinds of plans for 38 monster homes there, Those plans seem to have dissipated, at least for now. We're hoping to mount a campaign to acquire this site, a gorgeous site, as you can see. If you don't know where it is, it's about where Tamalpais and Fairview come together, just below the Arlington, and just to the north of the Hillside Natural Area. So anyhow, that's the sell job here. We need people to help us with that.
So beyond Fairview, where do you see the future?
Well, we have all kinds of trails throughout the town that are in the hillside, not the hillside area, that are impassable. We like to make them passable. We want them to be treated seriously as like transportation. Sure, they're recreation, but they're transportation too. The city council should work on doing this. Trail trekkers is not going away. We'll be doing this kind of stuff 50 years from now.
Well, let me ask you one more question, then we'll go to, there's a couple of comments in the chat space already.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, but before we go there, one more question. You've talked this evening about kind of what you might call benign neglect, at least by the city and by the community at large. Yet we've seen in more recent years, the city has reflected growing interest in environmental issues, a resonance of some of the concerns about preservation of open space that are much more prevalent throughout the country nowadays. Do you think that there is a greater opportunity and a greater sense of a community interest to get behind some of the things that Trail Trekkers has represented?
Oh yeah, I absolutely do. I have no doubt that every single member of the city council understands the value of Fairview open space. Yeah. I would rather that be open space than it be 38 mansions. I have no doubt about that. Yeah. I have no doubt that they realize the damage that developing there would do on creeks, and I have no doubt that they fully understand the rules and regulations that are preventing that kind of development, to destroying creeks. So, but they also don't have a bunch of money to use to buy this land, and it's a lot of money. It's a lot of work to raise that money, and hopefully we'll get Trust for Public Land to do a lot of the work. And I'm sure not looking forward to spending a year of my life calling people up asking for money. But anyhow,
but beyond Fairview, maybe we've had at least some hopeful impact on the community to catalyze and support the rising interest in the preservation of open space that we've seen around us.
Oh yeah, I think Trekkers has done a lot. I think we're a great group, and a lot of people enjoy coming to. And we're planning to have some real high one of these days.
Well, with that, let's move over. If you can click on it, open up the chat space right here, and we'll see what we have there. The first one goes back to the beginning when we were talking about the Bufano statue, and Barbara commented that about the statue at City College. Barbara, you want to say anything more about that, or do you want to?
Just a minute. Let me get activated here. Okay, here I am. There's a Bufano statue called St. Francis of the Guns. It looks basically like the one that Dave showed, but it's made out of a different material. It has a mosaic on the front with civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King and others. And then the main part of it is made out of metal that is actually melted down guns that were bought back at some point in the city of San Francisco in one of those weapons buybacks that the cities and the police periodically have. And so the official title of the sculpture is St. Francis of the Guns. And it's right at one of the main entrances to City College. I'm on the Works of Art committee there, and we chose it to be on our parking permit a couple years ago. So there were hundreds of parking permits hanging around the city with St. Francis of the Guns on it. If you drive by on, used to be Phelan Avenue, and now it's called Frida Kahlo Way, you can see it without parking and getting off and walking around in the campus. So that's all. There's many of the St. Francis's around the city. It was one of his iconic things.
Is there anything more you want to add to that, Dave? Okay. Claire, I see your comment in here. I think this is back when we were talking about maybe Motorcycle Hill, or at least what did the hills look like in past, and you're commenting on a friend who said that there were no trees at the time. You want to follow up on that at all?
She just said it was a great, from a kid's perspective, they used to take cardboard and slide down the hill and stuff like that. So I don't know when or how those trees got up at the top.
You're referring to Motorcycle Hill specifically, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, speaking of volunteers, and a lot of volunteers planted those trees. I mean, there's the Memorial Grove right by the entrance to the hillside by the recycling center, and those trees all memorialize famous people. And I think a lot of people just used to go around and just plant trees. Well, there's some oddball trees you see growing in that hillside area.
Well, we kind of know that a lot of the trees up there have been just within the last century or two. The eucalyptus were all imported, and a lot of the other. In fact, one of the things that the broom pulling is all about is getting into the invasive plants that have grown up throughout those areas.
People used to describe what's today the recycling center, that old quarry, as being the ugliest gash you ever saw in your life. And that's because there weren't all the trees around it covering it up, And much as you hate pampas grass, it probably wasn't so much that pampas grass. You just saw the giant, stone, which of course geologists love. Geologists love looking at that thing because you can learn so much. But yeah, and I have to go down, look at the Historical Society photos to see what this town really looked like before there were trees. It was something else.
So John's commented in the chat that he was one of those kids sliding down the hills on the cardboard. You wanna tell us about that, John?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes,
Yeah.
You can. The area that I live in, we moved here in 1948, and shortly thereafter, every house had 2 to 6 children or so growing up in it. And the hillsides were completely open with grass. And we would take cardboard and come down, and we had broken bones and such, but you know what? It was a thrill. And we happened to be right above the ledge that drops down to become the quarry. And there was quite a bit of excitement. We all played right along that ledge. And one day, a little boy, Johnny Rush, managed to fall over. And it was one of the most exciting things that I remember as a kid, because he fortunately grabbed a hold of some branch or tree, and the fire department came and they put a rope down, and some brave fireman went down on the rope and got this little boy who was probably, 6 or so at the time, and brought him back up. The eucalyptus trees have changed everything in terms of views from the hillsides.
Okay. So that was obviously before there was a big fence there.
Oh, there were no fences.
Yeah. And do you remember that as being just sort of a completely open, unsupervised region of the town?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and Mosier hadn't been put through. Mosier stopped right down where Portola used to be, and so that whole area up that hill was open, and it was populated by pollywog ponds. At least that's what we thought of them as, because we always went there to catch pollywogs. There was also a nice group of pollywog ponds where the El Cerrito Park, the Arlington Park, is now. after Tiny's stable burned down, and that was turned into a park.
So I would also encourage people, if you want to ask questions, to actually unmute yourself and ask them direct out. Yeah, there's the Urban Forest Committee, to answer this question about eucalyptus. I would urge people to go to meetings of the Urban Forest Committee. There are meetings. A lot of public meetings are boring, but they get really in depth about trees. You can really learn a lot about. Some of these members of the committee, they know the trees in El Cerrito almost by name. So anyhow, they're talking about the issue of it costs a lot to take a eucalyptus tree down.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of other tree issues besides that. We're having sudden oak death. We're having acacias. We're having the EQC, Environmental Quality Committee, and the Urban Forest Committee might be doing a project one of these days to put mulch around some redwood trees in various places in El Cerrito, because the drought is so bad that these trees are facing death. So trees are having a hard time, and it's with lack of money, it's getting hard to prioritize what to do with which tree. And then eucalyptus, bad as they are in many ways, they also still provide habitat. So then this question: do you want to take them all down, or what do you want to do with them? And I don't know.
Let me follow up on Brian's question a little bit, and Brian, I'll ask you to come in here too if you want to. But now in the last few years, because we have such an increased risk of fire, and the eucalyptus are very, very fire prone, perhaps that has shifted the balance a little bit in terms of the value, even given the high cost of doing some eucalyptus removal. What do you think of that?
It's a real problem for those of us who live up here near them, in that, for example, my homeowner's insurance, which we've carried for 30 plus years, was just canceled. I was given a month notice. And the reason is you're in a high fire zone, and we don't care it doesn't fit our profile, and we're not going to insure you anymore. And I'm not alone. This is happening all up in this area. Fortunately, I was able to secure continuing insurance with a different carrier.
Do you think there would be well, obviously the city has no money. We have negative money. Do you think there would be homeowners might be willing to band together and create a privately funded fund to take out at least, I look up and I see some dead trees in there in the hillside. So I guess the city could remove it, but given the devastating wildfires recently, I'm just wondering if there's a sort of a private philanthropy.
I think there's actually funding through the state and the federal government, especially if any of the infrastructure kind of ideas come through for funding. A neighbor of mine works with the fire department, I think down near Oakland, and he said at one point the city or some neighborhood in the city they got the federal government to give them $150 million to remove eucalyptus from the hillside in part of Oakland. And this was like 5 years ago. So, that was maybe more. And then, but they got the approval for the money, but then a bunch of residents took issue with removing the eucalyptus because they liked the trees there. And then because the argument started, like the funding just dried up. So they lost it.
El Cerrito has had a similar situation about, 30 or more years ago. There was a great battle of the trees up here in the hills. Sandy Kerr was one of the proponents of let's keep the trees. And a number of other people up here were, goddamn eucalyptus, let's get them out of here. We can't see San Francisco anymore, which is true. When I moved here, we could see all the way from Mount Hamilton in the south up well beyond perhaps to St. Helena to the north. So we had this whole sweep of the bay, and now it's you have a sweep of eucalyptus.
I wonder if people would be amenable to just having more native trees like live oak, planted.
Oh, I would. They don't grow nearly as tall, for one thing.
Yeah,
and they're slower at getting there when they do.
And they don't have the fire hazard.
Right. And there is a very active group up here, a couple of doors down from me. It's led by a lady that's very interested and concerned about the fire risks. So there are groups that could build on the enthusiasm that there already is for controlling fire risk to maybe get some funding.
Yeah.
El Cerrito Fire Safe is the group he's talking about.
Right.
And so trekkers, we get involved with these fire issues, but we let them basically handle that. I mean, I'm in contact with them a lot. You know, in doing some broom pulls recently, we leaned on the city. There had been a whole bunch of piles of debris in Madeira open space that had been, you know, chopped down to clear things out several years ago by, you know, I forget what you call them. I always call them prisoners, which is what they were, but there's a name for them. Crews from prison, but they left like 20 or 30 or 40 piles of like debris, and so trekkers kind of brought this up to the city, and so they went in there and mostly burned them. The fire department over the past month or so, you know, burned some of these because those piles themselves presented kind of a danger. But yeah, speaking of oaks, trekkers worked with some Montessori students quite a few years ago to plant oaks, and Stephen Prey, you know, the city's arborist, is always working to get more oaks going in the hillside. So yeah, the whole tree issue, it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara's mentioned in the chat that there's, you know, that she's aware of a lot of other kind of potential funding sources available. Claire's offered a link to an article. Claire, what's that article about?
One I sent you guys the other day, the one about a group of Kensington homeowners have organized a 24/7 fire watch during fire season.
Wow.
Yeah, there are a number of, I guess, wildlife camps or fire camps set up throughout Wildcat and Tilden. So people are staying up late at night monitoring these things.
Well, it strikes me, you know, in the context of the history that we were talking about, that this turn of the conversation has sort of opened up a potential area for us to think about. Coming back to that last question about the future.
Well, yeah,
maybe,
I mean,
you know, fire protection is an important thing that related to natural area preservation that we need to be thinking more about.
Well, if you look around the Wildcat, you know, the border of El Cerrito and Kensington with the Wildcat. I'm not sure. Do you guys go up walking there, you know, the old schoolhouse trail, okay? It used to be you walking on that trail and you look into Wildcat Canyon and you wouldn't see it. You would not see Wildcat Canyon. And now, boom, you know, it's like, because they've taken out so much brush over the years. I mean, the past 3-4 years. It really is opened up. And in the hillside itself, the broom removal that we've done and Friends of Five Creeks have done has really changed the look of the hillside area over the past several years. I've seen people on Nextdoor say how about the hillside area is getting worse and more dangerous because of not controlling brush. But that's not true in the slightest. It's nowhere near as overgrown as it used to be. So, you know, yeah, this is something changing too. And, you know, one thing we have online, David Ackerley, who's the dean of the Rouser School of Natural Resources at Cal, gave a real and then a virtual recorded talk about how climate change is going to be changing the trees and various plants in the hillside. That's something else about the future, and that's also worth watching. If you go to our festival page, you can find a link to it. Okay, well, we're coming to like 7:20.
There's one other question in the chat.
Okay.
Is there any history of fires in El Cerrito? Have there been some catastrophic ones in Berkeley? There was a huge one in Berkeley, as we know. There was the Oakland Hills fire, even more recently than the Berkeley fire. What about El Cerrito? Are you aware?
No, I don't believe there was ever a major, and with the Historical Society, it's not in our book about his history of El Cerrito. So there's never been one of those catastrophic come up out of the wilderness and go through the houses kind of thing. No.
Of course, El Cerrito is a little bit of a newer community. I don't think it was that built up when the Berkeley fire took place.
No, it wasn't. No. But no, the answer is no.
The potential is still there now, though.
Well, let's just hope.
Okay. So we are kind of coming up to the end of our time here. We didn't want to stretch out too long and get into everybody's dinner hour. If you have any more questions, comments you want to put in the chat, or you want to raise your hand, now's the time to do it. This is the resource that we have on hand here for the moment, and this is your chance to throw anything you want at here. I'm not seeing any more chat, and I'm not seeing any hands going up. So I think, Dave, you've illuminated and educated us all this evening, and I'm grateful for the time that you've been able to share with us.
Okay.
Thank you.